We've talked a lot about Twisted Metal on this channel, and why shouldn't we? It's a great but tragically underrepresented series. Despite its longevity and iconic status, it's only had a handful of games. But with that, I have a bit of a story to tell. Recently, I was at my local retro game shop doing what I usually do, picking out a few games I've never heard of that popped out at me. When I went there, I found a game called Road Trip Vacation 2012. I played it and thought, this seems an awful lot like Twisted Metal. And that got me thinking. I have, or have heard of, quite a few games that are like Twisted Metal but aren't, made in that short window of time when car combat games were extremely popular. So I thought, why the hell not? I should make a video covering some of these games. So this is the Twisted Metal Knockoff collection. Please note, knockoff does not necessarily mean bad, it just means an imitation or copy. It has some negative connotations, but as you'll see, some of these games are good and some of them are not so good. Also, please note that the vast majority of these games I'm playing for the first time, so there may be some things I get wrong, and I may also not be the best at some of them, because having to get used to separate control schemes for several games I'm playing for the first time is not an easy task. With that, let's start with a game I guarantee none of you have ever heard of. Back in the late 90s, Sony dropped the licensing cost for developing games on PlayStation. This was meant to open up the PlayStation to smaller developers making games on a budget, but it was a double-edged sword. More games could be made, but that also meant that the dying years of the PlayStation 1 had some real mediocrity. Case in point, Grudge Warriors, made by Tempest Software and published by Take-Two Interactive. If you've never heard of Tempest, neither have I. Isn't that splash page a thing to behold? Although Woven War made a song called Tempest, it's one of my favorite songs ever. Grudge Warriors was essentially made to answer the question, what if Twisted Metal but with level objectives? Which is like asking, what if ice cream but with gravy? I bought this game on a whim because it kinda looked interesting, and it's probably the game I played for the least amount of time on this list. Like most TM games, you have a selection of colorful characters you can pick. This game was way ahead of its time. That said, your selection of team doesn't matter because everybody gets the same weapons, which kinda defeats the purpose of even having a character selection. They might have subtle differences in the handling and the speed, but I didn't notice any. They might also have different endings, but if you've played through this game as one team, you've essentially played through as them all. You have a Twisted Metal sort of setup where you have an arena, opposing enemies to fight, and hazards all over the place, but the level doesn't end when you've beaten all your opponents. Oh no, you have to go around slightly confusingly laid out levels and blow up crucial objectives and collect tokens. This completely shoots the pacing in the foot. Blowing up the other vehicles is the fun part, it's the core gameplay. So eliminating that from the experience in order to make you drive around a maze for a couple minutes to find the next major area, does that sound like fun? As a matter of fact, you don't even need to blow up enemies at all, it's the generators that matter. Unlike its other contemporaries, you don't have a selection of weapons to pick up in Grudge Warriors. You have them all by default, and you only have 3 major ones. You have a burst laser, a grenade, and an auto-tracking missile. You also have a rapid-fire laser as the machine gun style weapon, but it's so piss-weak it's not even worth bothering with. In fact, if you're smart, the only weapon you should be using is the auto-tracking missiles because it's the only one that does damage worth a damn and the game auto-aims at the nearest visible enemy. It doesn't have much ammo, but refill stations are pretty much everywhere, so you're never gonna have much of a shortage. I'm not gonna lie, I didn't even beat the second level. I beat the first level on the 3rd attempt after realizing I didn't even need to go into the level boss area, which itself is a small circular arena, had a blowtorch that decimates you in a second and you can't even see it unless it's directly above you, and a flying enemy that the camera refuses to focus on. But after realizing that I simply missed one of the generators early on, I managed to nut that one out, but the second level kicks things up a notch. I beat every visible enemy on the level and simply could not find out how to turn off the purple lasers to destroy the last couple generators. I wandered around for 20 minutes trying to figure this one out, until I had to look it up. Turns out there's an easily missable destructible wall that you have to trick an invincible turret to blow up, because that was made clear. Why would I even go into that area with the invincible turret? The fact that it's invincible incentivizes you not to go near it. Then I was locked into the level boss arena and narrowly defeated it, and I knew exactly what was going to happen next. I was going to step out of the arena and the invincible turret was going to take what little health I had left because I couldn't leave its line of sight quickly enough, and that's exactly what happened. I could have beaten this level with one more try, but the trial and error crapshoot that this game was demonstrating itself to be was already becoming too frustrating for me to bother with, and I did not want to see what else it had up its sleeve, especially when I need to look up the solution to something that should be simple. That's the issue with games based around maze-like environments like this. You end up bumbling aimlessly when you just want to move on. When you're in the thick of the action and you know what to do, this game isn't bad. The vehicle physics aren't amazing, but they're workable, although it doesn't lend itself to narrow platforms, and the stream of endless bombardment from enemies all around you creates an atmosphere of chaos which is kind of stimulating. It's the dead space that really kills it. And there's a lot more dead space than action. Those 20 minutes of wandering killed any goodwill I had. I see a good game in here somewhere, and there aren't too many changes they'd need to make. A mini-map, for example, or something to let us know where the nearest generator is. A hint system, maybe. But unfortunately, this game is nothing more than an admirable attempt at a budget Twisted Metal style game that didn't really work out. Critical Depth is an interesting one. It was essentially made to answer the question, what if Twisted Metal but underwater? And the end result is honestly a pretty excellent game. In quotation marks. Which makes sense when you look at the developer. It's made by Single Track Entertainment. Yeah, the same people who made the first Twisted Metals went on to make this. Well, what happened was, they wanted to strike out and move on to bigger and better things after their deal with Sony ended, making new IPs, becoming a publisher themselves, and so on, but that all went down the toilet when they were bought out by GT Interactive, making Critical Depth the first game under their new parent company. So, the idea of Critical Depth is similar to Twisted Metal, but with the added twist of being under the sea, you can freely travel in 3 dimensions. Also, unlike other games of this type, you don't actually need to destroy other vehicles, which is seemingly becoming a running theme. The idea is, you need to pick up 5 pods, and once you have all 5, you can travel through the portal to the next level. So you could technically play this game as a complete pacifist minus the bosses, but if other characters grab the pods, then you're gonna have to start blasting, because they'll only drop the pods if they take significant damage. Despite being fun, I think the critical flaw of Critical Depth is inherent in its premise. When your movement is restricted to ground level, there's more strategy to employ because there are a lot more things that can get in your way, and a lot more opportunities for stunts and verticality. But the freedom in Critical Depth makes for a less strategic gameplay, as there aren't as many things that can get in your way. If there's set dressing between you and your opponent in any other game of this genre, you have to navigate the environment, but simply being able to freely go over or around obstacles makes the act of tracking down your opponents and laying into them less strategic and therefore less interesting. This issue is mitigated in the levels in more enclosed areas, but those levels have issues of their own, namely the difficulty of navigating without crashing into the walls constantly. The issue of the open level design is especially prominent when you have an enemy in your sights, because there's not much they can do to get away when you're locked and loaded and they have nowhere to go. Although the same can apply to you, which can make the game brutally difficult at times, especially on the higher difficulties. In fact, the difficulty is kinda why I consider this game good with inverted quotation marks. It's fun to play, but not fun to beat. Because first of all, they do the same thing that Twisted Metal 2 did, where they kick you to the main menu halfway through if you're playing on easy, but unlike Twisted Metal 2, which was manageable on medium, this game gets relentless later on. And second, the part that kills it for me is that the lives you start with are the lives you have for the entire game, even if you load a save. So you have to survive like a dozen levels on 3 lives and very few options for getting extra lives. Sorry if this sounds like mad 'cause bad, but I feel like the die 3 times, start from scratch, no exceptions thing should have been left in the 80s. If you die at any point, you're borrowing from the future because that's a life you'll never get back and you may need later on. And when you get put into situations like this, sorry if I feel like 3 lives is a bit unreasonable. It almost feels like the developers had nothing but contempt for the people who didn't have the time nor patience to become godly at their games. And I wonder if Sony were the ones keeping them in check somewhat with that attitude. Still, the gameplay has a visceral kick to it, especially if you up the game speed, which I definitely recommend. It has some unique and interesting ideas that shake up the core formula beyond the underwater elements, such as the shield, which uses up your energy really quickly but is crucial for surviving intense firefights, and the weapons are very impactful. My personal favorite was the sucker. You just aim it vaguely near an enemy and it sucks them in and explodes. The range is pretty insane too. These slow torpedoes were also a personal favorite. It's interesting to note as well that the different pods will give you different bonuses, such as bonus damage or armor. So it's good to get them early because the leading player will have the biggest advantage. Not much to say beyond that, honestly. It's Twisted Metal but underwater. The physics are good, the gameplay is satisfying, and it also has one of the most unnecessarily shocking intro cutscenes I've seen. God damn, they Ark of the Covenanted him. I'd say this is a unique take on the genre that manages to do justice to its ideas and is able to stand out in its own right as a solid game with a distinct but familiar identity. Just don't be shocked if you need to activate cheats to beat it. As I said at the top of the video, this was the game that inspired this little retrospective. It was the game that Single Track made immediately after Critical Depth. And where Critical Depth had a unique spin on the formula, this is essentially just a reskin of Twisted Metal 2. Different levels, different story, different characters. Wieners, wieners, wieners! Put them in your mouth! But you have essentially the same physics, the same gameplay, and the same general feel. So this game is basically good by default. I will say right off the bat, Rogue Trip is very cynical, in that the entire game is a satire of hyper-consumerist culture. The game opens in 2012, oh dearie me, isn't that quaint, in a post-apocalyptic landscape where despite the world being literally a wasteland, this scumbag is still trying to sell vacation packages, and he's barely able to keep up the pretense of not being a complete scuzzbucket. By the sweat and blood of those zany, wacky, oppressed lower classes, Big Daddy's made his little paradises shine like gemstones amidst the teeming crud of our sad little dying world. I'm a fan of satirical looks at society, but this is about as on the nose as it gets, and the satire is a bit incongruous with this game's incredibly crude sense of humor. Still, the tourism angle gives this game a unique twist where you can collect money from either pickups or by taking the level tourist around to take photos. Doing so will give you a bundle of cash from which you can buy weapon upgrades or health at the designated stations. So if you can manage to get the tourist in your car and take all 6 photos, then you can pretty much just hang around the health refill station and not have to worry about much of anything. Which somewhat balances out the traditionally unforgiving difficulty for Single Track's games. So aside from fighting for the sake of fighting, you also have to battle for the tourist, making use of one of this game's most unique items, the eject item. Fun stuff. Although most enemies tend to target you whether you have the tourist or not, but don't target each other so much even if one of the CPUs has the tourist, so it's hard to get the tourist and even harder to keep the tourist. It's honestly kind of an issue with the entire genre that CPU players are often programmed to go easy on each other. I guess honor among thieves and all that, so instead of being a free-for-all, it tends to be you against the world. The frustration of which varies from game to game. Otherwise, not much more to say than that. It's a reskin of TM2 with some extra bits tacked on that gives a moderately unique spin to the genre, and that's fine by me. It's exactly what you want and expect out of these games. I like the unique environments, I like how intricate the level design is, I like the part where you can blow up the world. It's a solid game, and that's good enough for me. This was pretty much the last thing of note that Single Track Entertainment made before being shut down. They made a few games after this, first of all Streak Hoverboard Racing, what an unfortunate name, which was to Jet Moto what these past 2 games were to Twisted Metal. Then they made a third-person tactical shooter called Outwars, and neither of these games gained any level of traction, and the final nail in the coffin came when they resorted to licensed games with Animorph's Shattered Reality, a painfully average 2.5D platformer. But by that point, most of the original staff had left to form Incognito Inc. Given how many ambitions Single Track had that ultimately never came to fruition, maybe it was for the best that they hit the reset switch, and I respect that. One of my personal philosophies is, if at first you don't succeed, burn the f***er to the ground and dance in the ashes. So, I have a confession to make. Recently, I've been getting into PS1 emulation. I don't actually own Vigilante 8 or its sequels, and I wanted to use this retrospective as an opportunity to try out different recording methods. So with that, I'm playing this on DuckStation and recording it with OBS to see how it works out. Wish me luck. Vigilante 8 and its sequel were made by Luxaflux, whom also made another unrelated game on this compilation. Vigilante 8 has easily been my most requested game to cover on this list, and I can see why. Because there's really not even a but at the end of the phrase, "this is Twisted Metal but." You got multiple varied vehicles, various weapons and attacks you can pick up around the environment. You win after you beat all the other vehicles on the map. The maps are self-contained arenas with a bunch of arena-specific contextual events going on, and you even have vehicle-specific special attacks. Although they don't auto-generate like Twisted Metal, you have to find the pickups. But otherwise, there are some significant differences. I think the single most major change is the vehicle physics. Twisted Metal has traditionally always felt very arcadey, whereas the physics in Vigilante 8 feel more weighty and realistic, which is a bit of a mixed blessing. When you have quicker, more breezy combat, it doesn't feel quite as impactful because it doesn't feel quite as real. But on the other hand, arcadey controls makes for more ease of access. There are strengths and weaknesses to both, so would I say that the gameplay of Twisted Metal or Vigilante 8 is better? Honestly, I think they're both based as f for different reasons. But in the case of Vigilante 8, the physics makes the gameplay hit harder and makes the weapons have some real impact. It's really satisfying to lay into your opponents, and the unique weapon selection helps to make the game stand out. There's a much larger focus on long-range combat with a selection of weapons that will track down the targeted enemy across the map. On one hand, this makes it so the combat can be a bit like trench warfare, where you're just lobbing things at each other from across the map, but on the other hand, it also means that you're never safe, so there's a constant tension in the air. And don't get me wrong, there's still plenty of opportunities to get up close and personal with these bastards. You also only have one life per level, which is fine by me because it means they had to balance the difficulty so that you can beat it on one life. I mean, if you're balancing each level to be beaten with 2 or 3 lives and you're only given 2 or 3 lives to beat the game, then it's not exactly setting you up for long-term success, because either way you can't afford to die. So I think the difficulty balancing is actually very fair in Vigilante 8. Aside from that, there's a bunch of little differences. First of all, each character's story only takes up 4 levels each, so you can get through each character's story in 20 to 30 minutes if you're good. But also, every character has a unique selection of levels with slightly unique objectives, rather than just doing the same story mode 8 times. You get some repeated levels, but never in the same order, so there's some nuanced progression here. Kinda like Grudge Warriors, you have level objectives to fulfill, like protecting a thing or destroying a thing. It adds a little bit of spice to the proceedings, but unlike GW, they're fully optional, so it's there if you want to do it, but doesn't hinder the experience for anybody that can't be asked. The same goes for the whammies and the totaling. Whenever you defeat an enemy, the option will come up to total it, but I never quite figured out what that meant or how to do it. It seems to be like the fatalities in Mortal Kombat, kind of just an extra thing to do once they're already down. You don't need to know how to do it, but it's cool if you do. And I only vaguely know what whammies are. I think it's when you stack an attack on top of another attack, but I'm not 100% sure on that. You'll get a tally at the end of the levels, but that's the only real impact these two mechanics have on the gameplay at large, so at its absolute worst, it's inoffensive. There's also a shield pickup, which adds a bit of strategy to the levels, because timing the pickups can be a matter of life and death in some situations. They even have dynamic level alteration, where if you destroy certain things, you can alter the layout of the level in order to reach new items or gain an aerial advantage. Dynamic level alteration isn't something that's unheard of in this genre, but it's not done nearly enough for my liking. It makes these worlds feel more alive when we're able to have a lasting impact, even if it's only done for the sake of gameplay. I think the one major flaw I can think of with this game is the turning. It feels a bit delayed, and the quick turn option kinda overcorrects this issue, so movement can be a bit of a hassle, but it's something that I got used to. Honestly, up until now, I've considered various games in the Twisted Metal franchise to be the gold standard for the genre, but I think Vigilante 8 gives the best of Twisted Metal a run for its money. Sorry to be uncontroversial for once, but Vigilante 8 represents some of the best that this genre has to offer. Solid game, highly recommended. Okay, so confession time again. I wanted to go with 10 games for this retrospective, but I found 9 games that interested me, but could not for the life of me pick a 10th. To fit my criteria of a Twisted Metal knockoff, I'd either need to set up PCSX2 to play something like Motor Mayhem Vehicular Combat League, which I've heard is a bit of a pain in the ass, or I'd have to go with something that nobody's ever heard of like Smash and Survive. So I decided to say screw it, I'm just gonna cover the sequel to Vigilante 8. I mean, the first game was such a big request, might as well. And I have very mixed feelings about this game. It's essentially the exact same game as the first, with about a dozen new features. Some good, some bad. But regardless of everything I'm about to say, I still think this game is at least fun to play. Okay? Okay. The biggest positive change is the handling, which has been greatly improved for the most part. almost overcorrected even, so it's almost hard to stop turning after you've started, or it's easy to turn too far, but either way it's been improved. One further addition I appreciate are the RPG elements. Each vehicle has specific stats, nothing new, but every time you blow away one of your opponents, they drop stat buffs which you can pick up. It doesn't improve it outrageously, but it's an extra edge that can be the difference maker and gives you a reason to continue playing beyond basic completion. They also really stepped up their game as far as the dynamic level alterations in some cases, like the Louisiana level where if you open the floodgates, you actually flood the entire level, which is the only way to get certain items. Total contextual level alteration is actually something I've wanted in Twisted Metal for some time. I didn't realize that stuff like this had already been done in one of its competitors. The side objectives have also been somewhat improved. There are some that are no more complicated than the last game, but then some levels like Utah have it to where you have to compete in the Winter Olympics. That is goofy and I love it. So yeah, those are all the positive improvements I can think of. As for the negatives, well, first of all, they made all the campaigns significantly longer. Double the amount of levels if I'm not mistaken, and this isn't necessarily to the game's benefit. One of the things I liked about the campaigns in the first Vigilante 8 was how breezy they were. The levels themselves also have the Twisted Metal 4 problem where they just tend to go on for too long, I found. Possibly due in part to the size of the levels. I mean, it still only took me about an hour and a half to finish one character's story, but that's still 3 to 4 times the length that it was in the first game. Another addition that's used to mixed effect is the vehicle transformation pickups. You can make your car amphibious, into a hover car, or into a snowmobile, but I find that the hover mode is unwieldy and makes certain weapons hard to use, then amphibious mode is also quite unwieldy in the controls department, and the snowmobile has the opposite issue, where in levels like Alaska or Utah, it's designed to where if you don't have it, it's nearly impossible to control your vehicle. Also, now you can't go back and pick up specials that were just slotted out of your inventory. Yeah, I didn't mention this before, but you only have 3 weapon slots, and if you pick up a 4th, the weapon that's currently selected will be slotted out in favor of the one you just picked up. But on more than one occasion here, I had collected a few specials, but accidentally ran into a weapon I didn't want and lost them, not being able to pick them up again. Specials are hard to come by in this game and kick several varieties of ass. If used correctly, they can absolutely level your opponents. Like my main one that I used will do damage, but will also stun characters within a certain range. So if used with things like the manual aim rockets or the otherwise useless flamethrower, you can take out more than half a health bar in one go, and that's only one example. Every special is equally overpowered, which is in contrast with the last game where there was somewhat of an imbalance there. The Beehive one held you in place for like 10 seconds doing consistent damage, but every other special was kinda weak by comparison. So the fact that the specials are so great here makes it doubly perplexing why they wouldn't let you pick it back up if you accidentally dropped them. These are all fairly minor issues that one can overlook, but there is one major issue that's not present in the first game that really felt like a wet blanket on the experience for me. And it has to do with the aforementioned level objectives. The previous game had level objectives, but they were easily ignored. Not so much in this game. You're given 2 objectives per level this time around, and the item side quests are the problematic ones. Sometimes you have to drop off items at designated spots, and the game won't let you finish the level if you have any objective-specific items in your inventory, and they're really bad at explaining how to drop off items. Leading to one point where I was wandering around for 20 minutes thinking there was a glowing icon or whatever to drop the items off at. Nope, turns out you have to go to a specific spot, select the items, and press the weapon button. That was frustrating, especially the fact that I had to look it up when I shouldn't have to, but it's really only an issue once. The real issue with this system is in how the items play into your inventory. If you collect any of the critical items for objectives, that takes up one of your 3 precious weapon slots. In the levels where you have to deliver them, that at least lets you free up a weapon slot, but in some levels you can't get rid of them. They're just a permanent fixture in your inventory that occupies one of your weapon slots. Why did they do this? Why not just have a special weapon slot for the critical items? What incentive do I have to do the optional objectives if this is what the result is? Unlocking the side characters isn't that important to me. This means that you can only carry 2/3 the amount of weapons you normally could, which severely hinders your combat ability for no real material gain. In fact, I see these as obstacles to avoid rather than anything positive. But especially when you're playing this for the first time, there's no indication on what's an item and what's an actual weapon you can use. So you might accidentally hinder your combat ability just thinking this is an actual weapon, or you might hinder your combat ability just because you accidentally picked one up. These issues combined really took a chunk out of my enjoyment of Second Offense. The sad thing about all of this, the game I really liked is still here. Everything that was great is still great. The combat still packs a punch, the levels are still creative, the driving physics are still satisfying when I'm not getting caught up in the scenery. It's a great game at its very core, but they were maybe a little bit too ambitious, because most of what they did add just clutters what was already a perfectly functional system of gameplay, making this another case of fun to play, not necessarily fun to beat, proving that more doesn't necessarily mean better. That was it for the Vigilante 8 series, except for the pseudo remake on the Xbox 360, but nothing since then, and we'll likely never see anything else. At least not from the original developers, since the developers were shut down in 2010 and their spin-off studio, which doesn't even have a Moby Games page, hasn't made a game since 2013. RIP. So, before we get into it, I just wanted to say, I tried. I bought this game legitimately, I bought new VGA cables to try and record this game optimally, I bought all the adapters, I plugged it all in, gave it all the proper power, and nothing. All the components together plus the game already cost a little bit more than I'm comfortable spending, so I decided, screw it, I'm emulating. This time with Redream, the Dreamcast emulator. It's not a perfect emulation, but it's about as good as we're gonna get. So, Luxaflux had a niche they wanted to stick to, so they decided to make a Star Wars game out of it, the result being Star Wars Demolition. Essentially what happened after Jabba the Hutt grew bored with pod racing. Well, this is exactly what it sounds like. It's Star Wars but Demolition, and if I'm not mistaken, this game was actually canon to the larger Star Wars extended universe before Disney happened. I may not know much about Star Wars, but I do know that George Lucas was crazy open about the extended universe, provided it was outside of certain time periods or events. People tend to have a mixed opinion on Star Wars Demolition, and yeah, I can kinda see why. Though it does some interesting things with the formula. For example, the weapon system is actually very creative. You have a standard weapon you can use, like the machine guns in any number of these games, but then you have weapons you can pick up which range from tractor beams to concussion missiles. But the twist is, you don't have ammo for these weapons. You have a limited amount of weapon power that regenerates over time, and you can hold down the attack button to get one of 4 different attacks. But there's a risk-reward factor in that a level 4 charge takes a while, and if you miss, that's a hefty amount of weapon charge to lose. There's also designated areas on the map where you can recharge shields and weapons, so it changes some core elements of the premise without changing the premise. The vehicle selection is also quite unique thanks to the setting. Much like most people will do, I chose the AT-ST first, but found it very awkward to use, especially in that its most powerful attack is a barrage of thrown bombs, which are very easy to miss, so it's not an optimal build. Also, because it has legs, I mistakenly thought that it would control like a third-person shooter, but no, it controls like a vehicle. I found the most convenient player to use is Wade Vox. I wonder if he is related to a Gleeman. He has decent speed, decent health, and a really devastating level 4 attack that's almost guaranteed to hit at close range, so he absolutely wrecks shit. The only negative thing about this weapon system is, if you run out of attack power, the only thing you can do is drive around and wait for it to recharge or try and find refill stations, so this game can be a bit stop and start at times because of that. As far as unique weapon concepts, I quite like the aforementioned tractor beam. You may ask, what use is a weapon which immobilizes your opponent in a game where you should be damaging them instead? Well, that's the neat thing. If you have a tractor beam, you can immobilize your opponent and drop them in a stage hazard like a Sarlacc pit. So as small as it is, it adds a bit of strategy to proceedings. There are a few more unique mechanics, but nothing worth getting passionate about. With that said, I just don't think this game feels very good to play. I think the biggest flaw in this game are the physics, which are basically non-existent. Look how Vox moves, it's so floaty. There's no weight to this whatsoever, no physical feedback of the vehicle or the environment. And that goes for every vehicle regardless of size. So the controls just don't feel satisfying, and neither does the game as a whole really. It feels like the complete opposite of Vigilante 8. It's kind of a fundamental flaw that takes away a lot of the spark from the new and interesting ideas this game has. Still, I did find myself having fun with this. It balances out relatively evenly, and it held my interest long enough for me to beat it. But I have very little desire to go back. It's a bit of an odd genre choice for Star Wars, but it's still basically okay. And the unique elements of Star Wars gives it enough of an individual identity that it can stand out from the pack. I give it a solid C+. Now, this was a game that was recommended to me for this video. I've never heard of it, but it turns out it was a super early Xbox game that was later ported to PS2 and GameCube and has since had an HD re-release. I'm playing the GameCube version via Dolphin because when it comes to emulation, Dolphin is the king of ease of access, he says as his computer blue screens. No joke, that actually happened. So this game was essentially made to answer the question, what if Twisted Metal but wacky? And I mean really wacky. If Twisted Metal 2 is like Saints Row 2, then Cel Damage is like Saints Row 4. And the pattern of these games having absolutely no subtlety continues. One of the characters here is called Dominique Trix. Can't get much less subtle than that. But I'm gonna pick Violet because I think she's cute. Sue me. And, oh god. This is just, wow. Okay, so yeah, Cel Damage really doesn't mess around. This is the game for which the term relentless was invented. Like, you're just airdropped in and immediately you're getting blown to Kingdom Come in one hit and respawning in a second. Yeah, that's the thing you'll notice right off the bat. Where most of these games have a health bar, this game activates the one-hit kill cheat and turns the speed dial way up. I'm gonna warn you right now, if you get motion sickness easily, probably best to look away now. I don't really get motion sick, but even I was feeling a bit icky after about an hour of playing. The pace is so chaotic. The camera bouncing around like crazy, your car flipping like Ricochet on speed, it's just a barrage of lights and sounds being thrown in your face. And that's not to say I didn't enjoy it though. I actually found it weirdly fun. You die frequently, but you respawn so quickly that the game never loses its frenetic pace, and the weapons are definitely the most unique set of weapons out of any of these games, but they're really fun to use. The best part is, this is probably the first case that I've seen in the entire car combat genre where melee weapons are actually more useful than ranged weapons. You can't really aim explosives accurately because everybody's moving around so quickly, and the guns take a few seconds to take someone out. A few seconds which might have you chopped in half by an axe, or sawed in half with a chainsaw. Plus, there's new weapons to unlock with practically every level. The physics in this game feel very rubbery, so you really feel the weight behind each attack, meaning the melee weapons really pack a satisfying punch. There are a few modes. There's the smack attack mode, which is a very standard mode for the genre, where you need to rack up enough points from killing other characters. Then you have the gate relay mode, which is very much just a glorified race, which is kinda meh. And then you have the flag relay mode, which is easily the lowlight of the game. You need to collect 4 flags and get to the capture point without dying, and the flags are on the move. So if you can actually get 4 flags and get to a specific part of the map without dying, you're a better man, or otherwise, than I. These 2 extra modes feel somewhat superfluous because they often feel indistinguishable from the smack attack mode, but if the game is based around combat and the combat is fun, then the game succeeds at what it sets out to do. So this game is definitely worth a look, especially for those of you with an iron gut. But man, this game is just crying out for a speed option like Critical Depth. This was another game recommended to me for this video, and I was hesitant at first because the idea of Twisted Metal but with monster trucks really didn't appeal to me. Having the vehicles be monster trucks instead of larger-than-life ridiculous vehicles implies this game was going to be a bit sterile. It's like comparing NBA 2K to NBA Jam, if you see what I mean, and to be honest, I feel like I was somewhat proven right. The fact is, this game does have a few problems, but no deal breakers. It's just, for me, it's not very exciting because the premise doesn't lend itself to being very exciting. It comes down to that element of reality. Monster trucks are an actual event you can go and see, so it feels comparatively mundane. I mean, paint it however you wish, but a monster truck is still a monster truck. Either way, this game definitely leans more Demolition Derby than any of the other games on this list, because they have a much higher emphasis on damaging your opponent by ramming into them as opposed to having weapons, which does make it stand out amongst the rest of these games. But that's not to say there aren't weapons. There are, but only a few per map, and you can only use them once. However, despite the decreased focus on ranged combat, because these weapons are so rare, they are overpowered as hell. Ramming your opponents to death takes some effort, but pretty much every weapon can destroy at least one of your opponents and still have ammo to spare. Yeah, that isn't particularly well balanced. It means that instead of fighting and trying to survive against insurmountable odds, I start every round by breaking the scenery and immediately looking for the nearest weapon. However, these weapons can also be used on you, and they are just as overpowered. So tread lightly, basically. A feature I'm intrigued by is the element of vehicle stats in the season mode. As you play, various parts of your vehicle will break down and affect your performance, incentivizing you to buy new ones. which puts to use the currency you get from the levels. You get currency by destroying your opponents, destroying the set dressing around the level, and using what's called Monster Jam mode, which is basically this game's equivalent of Rage of the Gods mode. So it gives you something to work towards in order to increase your effectiveness, but you're never going to be able to afford everything as the game goes on. So that was neat, but otherwise, I don't know, there's nothing wrong with this game. The controls are good, the gameplay is responsive, and it's a fair but reasonable challenge. It's just that the setting is kinda bland, and so I find myself bored by this game. And the fact that this game has nothing particularly wrong with it, but it also doesn't excel in any one direction adds to that, because a single unique selling point can be the thing that elevates a game to the next level. If this game was transferred into a more fantastical setting with more unique cars, I think I would enjoy it quite a bit more. But as it sits, I don't know, I just found my eyes glazing over. Yet another one that was recommended to me for this video, in this case solely based on the fact that it's considered by some to be the love child of Grand Theft Auto and Twisted Metal, and as a fan of both, I can dig that like a shallow grave. Although according to long plays I've looked up, it's not exactly a one-sitting game. I played it long enough to solidify my opinion though. So here's the setting. A plague has wiped out most of the human population and destroyed all world governments. The most fictional thing here is that the governments were functional to begin with. So what remains is a Mad Max-style world of crime and poverty. Definitely a good setting for this type of game, and our plot centers around this guy Mason Strong, who's out for revenge against a man who wronged him. I'm sure we've all been there. So with that framing the action, you have a sandbox to roam around in with your car. You have enemy factions to blow to Kingdom Come, various missions to do, collectibles to find, a wanted level system, and scrap to collect, which you can use to pay for upgrades. When I was told this was Twisted Metal by way of Grand Theft Auto, they weren't lying. Even the menus and HUD look similar, which is fine as long as the game is just as fun. Well, okay. So the first thing I noticed in the gameplay is that the camera's way too zoomed in. Unlike other games of this ilk, you seemingly can't change it either. I hit every button and checked all the menus and I couldn't find anything. And in a game where you need to constantly be aware of your surroundings to fight enemies, that's not exactly optimal. I was crashing quite a bit because I couldn't see things that I was turning into that would have otherwise been in my peripheral vision. The vehicle physics and controls also take some getting used to. At first I felt the standard turning was a bit stiff, but the handbrake turning was a bit too oversensitive, but I got used to that. I also found the difficulty to be really inconsistent. The opening missions are piss easy, but then out of nowhere you're put into a mission where you need to blow up 3 trucks while being shot at from every angle by guns and rocket launchers, unable to move. You have grenades, but the trajectory is hard to gauge in the 10 seconds before you're blown to hell. This took me like 10 tries, only to pass by the skin of my teeth. And that's pretty much the difficulty pattern for as much of the game as I played. It's all down to rocket launchers. As soon as they get involved, the game suddenly becomes unreasonably difficult because you're a big target and they rip you apart in seconds. Even beyond that, there are some odd design choices, like having a necessary mission item on this airport roof. I drove around for ages looking for some hidden ramp or something. Turns out you have to ramp from the car park on the other side of the street, which I assumed was incorrect because it didn't work at first. But sure enough, you have to awkwardly angle the jump because the ramp isn't aligned correctly, and you have to use the turbo with the perfect timing. Otherwise, you won't reach. When your only option to get a necessary item feels like an exploit, that's a design issue. As for the easier missions, some of them fall into the lesser GTA mission archetypes like tailing people or picking up things dropped by a truck. Thankfully though, most of these missions are over in a flash. I said most. So even at this game's worst, it's usually paced really well. The missions where you drive around and wreck shit in high-octane situations are fun, and generally just getting into random combat encounters are fun, and there's plenty of that, let me tell you. Plus, the random scrap you get from downed cars, which can be used for upgrades, rewards even the most inconsequential of gameplay. And this game has some neat ideas that take advantage of the openness, like a faction system where you can disguise yourself to get through enemy turf. It's also really neat how many NPCs and rival factions will just be duking it out while you're driving around, or how you can do the same. It makes the world feel much more alive than it would have otherwise. It's definitely a game that wouldn't have worked if it were linear or arena-based. Honestly though, even if nothing else in this game worked, there's still one thing that I would have to give Roadkill credit for, and that's the soundtrack. As a classic rock and metal fan, it seems like this soundtrack was specifically licensed for me. Don't Fear the Reaper is this game's intro song. And while not a massive soundtrack, it includes names like April Wine, Foghat, Foreigner, friggin' Judas Priest. Thank you, sir, may I have another? Although Jesse's Girl is a bit of an odd choice. Seems a bit tonally disconnected from the rest of the game. Now, like I said, I didn't beat this game, but I did play it for about 4 hours, and my general consensus is that I like this game. When I got down to it, it was an enjoyable experience. But I don't love Roadkill. However, I think there's a reason for that. I recognize that a lot of my issues with this game have to do with playing it for the first time. This definitely feels like a game that gets much better on repeat playthroughs. You need to already be used to the controls, the mechanical progression, the mission structure, and what Roadkill expects out of you. Because there is a lot more going on here than your average Twisted Metal-like game. Granted, I believe a game should be good the first time, but that's not to say that this game isn't good. It is good, but it feels like it'd be better once you've played it through once. It may be more primitive or restrictive than your average sandbox game these days, but that's just growing pains, and it's made worth it by the fact that it's also a sandbox game unlike any other that I've seen. And uniqueness is something that's sort of been lost to the sandbox genre these days, and something that it should embrace more. So take what I have to say with a grain of salt, and go check out Roadkill for yourself. I have yet another confession to make. I used to be a wrestling fan. I say I used to because these days outside of a few stars, there's not a single major wrestling company that gives me what I want out of wrestling. So it's been a while since I actually watched wrestling consistently, but the funny thing about the sport, as far as games, it has an inbuilt system of gameplay. Much like any other sport, you want to do what they do on TV, but in the game. However, I guess in the early 2000s, the executives at THQ had a collective stroke and decided a car combat game would be the perfect genre for a wrestling company. The premise is that Vince McMahon has taken over all major television networks. Who does he think he is, Rupert Murdoch? So after integrating his superstars into every channel, he spearheads a project called WWE Crush Hour, where his superstars will fight in a number of souped-up combat vehicles, which is surprisingly not the craziest idea he's had. First of all, I'm impressed by the roster. At over 30 vehicles to play as, this is easily the largest roster out of any of these games, but I guess it helps that they don't have to come up with any unique characters. I'm gonna play as the Dead Man, and no, I'm not talking about Chris Benoit, I'm talking about The Undertaker, because The Undertaker is the GOAT and I will not be told otherwise. Immediately, the gameplay kinda reminds me of the based as hell Jack X Racing, only about 1,000,000 times worse. You ever had one of those situations where you play a game and you get about 10 minutes in and you think, wow, I'm bored? That was Crush Hour in a nutshell for me. It's hard to pin down, no pun intended, exactly why I thought this game was so meh. I'd say it's a bunch of little things. The most glaring issue with this game is that it kinda just does the bare minimum for what the genre requires. It's just mostly empty arenas, cars, and bullets. No unique selling point to make it stand out from the rest of the genre, and the gameplay isn't good enough to compensate for the lack thereof. The physics aren't great, laying into your opponents doesn't feel particularly good, and so on. There are special weapons to use and a finisher you can save up for, but the special weapons are few and far between and have too little ammo, and the finisher takes too long to charge up. So 90% of your time attacking will be spent using the standard machine guns, which aren't very satisfying to use. Then, unlike most games in this genre, it's not game over when you die. In the standard mode, you need to get a certain amount of kills to win, but this also means that the last person to get the hit in gets the point. So your kills tend to get hijacked a lot, which is really exasperating. Cel Damage got away with this because most weapons kill you in one hit, so there's very little hijacking. There's also too many health pickups in Crush Hour, and they respawn too quickly, so you very rarely feel in any real danger. These issues combined makes for a real lack of tension. So most of the time you're spent just tottering around mindlessly shooting in a haze of boredom. Of course there are unique gameplay modes. I think the most interesting mode is the cage match. The last man standing in the cage gets first dibs at a contract, and then you need to run the contract to a capture point, but you can still get the contract if that player gets killed, so not being the last man standing in the cage doesn't really mean much so long as you're halfway decent at shooting. The most laughable mode I played is the hardcore match level, where you have to grab the championship belt and hold on to it for 30 unbroken seconds. The one game I played lasted all of 36 seconds. The level that made me stop playing the game altogether was the second star collecting game. You have to collect 10 stars that will appear in random places all around the level, basically making it about pure dumb luck whether or not you win this game. Try as I might, I rarely found myself in the right position to grab the stars and get ahead. Even when I did, I'd get curb stomped and lose one of my stars. Every time I felt this game was getting away from me, I restarted it, and then 20 minutes had passed. The first level, where I only had to get 5 stars to win, was frustrating enough, but seeing how frustrating it was to get 10, I saw the writing on the wall of where this game was going and decided to cut my losses. Thank you, f you, bye. I'm not gonna say this game is bad. It's the video game equivalent of Matt Hardy or D'Lo Brown. Nothing overtly wrong with it, but nothing particularly exciting either, and there aren't enough strong points to compensate for the weak points. Actually, you know what? Scratch that. I do think this game is bad. Bad for how painfully mediocre it is. I don't ever see myself going back to WWE Crush Hour, but hey, at least I got to see what Brock Lesnar would look like if he were an overgrown baby. And that was the Twisted Metal Knockoff collection. Some good, some bad, but all attempting to be roughly the same thing. If I were to rank every game I've covered today, I'd put Vigilante 8 in first for sheer excellence of execution, then Rogue Trip and Critical Depth in second and third respectively for taking what single track made and giving it a unique spin, then Cel Damage for being hectic yet distinctive fun, followed by Vigilante 8 Second Offense in fifth for being a messy but generally great game, then Roadkill for its sheer ambition and scale, having lower lows than most on this list but also having higher highs. Then Star Wars Demolition in 7th for its neat ideas but execution that leaves some to be desired. Monster Jam in 8th just for being kinda boring, Grudge Warriors in 9th for having a bit of potential and sporadic fun times to be had here and there but mostly poor execution, and WWE Crush Hour in 10th for just general poor, lazy execution. I gotta say, I enjoyed doing this little retrospective, despite being a much bigger production than I'm used to, so in the future I might do similar videos for other franchises that had imitators. I'm thinking of doing one for God of War, because everyone and their mother was ripping off God of War during a certain period of time. I already have a few ideas for that myself, but if you have any suggestions, I'd like to hear them. Otherwise, let me know what you think of this video, and don't forget to like and subscribe. I've been the King of Snark Style, representing Tactical Bacon Productions. Now, I don't really do long goodbyes, so wouldn't it be funny if I just cut this video off really suddenly?